Hello, welcome to the Game Dev London podcast. My name is Oscar Clark. I can't even say my name today. My name is Oscar Clark, and I've been involved in game development for too many years. Game Dev London is a fantastic community of creative and passionate game developers who just love making games, but not necessarily just stuck in London. It's a community of lots of people. What I'm going to try and do in this series of podcasts is to ask a question. What do you want to know about game development? So I'm going to try and answer it by telling you everything you want to know about game development, but never dared to ask. The first session, this one, is going to be asking who we're making games for. So I'm delighted that I've got Annie here. And Annie, I'm going to show you on the screen. Annie is joining us. Annie's from
Hi.
Perpetual Games. Hey, Annie. So do you want to tell people who you are and what you do?
Hi, my name is Annie Grudeva. I am creative director at Perpetual Games. We are working on our first-person RPG called Elegos. It's coming early next year. It's going to have a very strong modding aspect, and also I'm founder of Pixel. Pixel is a diversity and inclusion database that has information not only about how to make games more diverse and inclusive, but also practices that studios can adopt to make everyone feel welcome.
Sounds fantastic. Exactly the kind of stuff that we need more of. We have I think, an amazing point in history where almost everybody is playing games. I think one of the sort of things about the pandemic is we've just suddenly realized that games is now part of our cultural DNA in a way that I think people like yourself and me have known for years, but I think a lot of people haven't really understood. And I think the pandemic has been such a kind of obvious mechanism of us having to use digital connections. And what a better way than to do it through play? Do you think that's fair?
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic honestly brought me one of the biggest wonders that I never ever expected is going to happen in my life. My mother asked us to play a video game together. And I was honestly stupefied because I was like, I don't know what my mom can play. Like from controls to story to everything else. You're not prepared for that kind of question.
But I think this takes us back to the point of what we're trying to explore in this particular session, which is who are we making games for? And I think
Mm.
one of the one of the sort of problems I have when I have games pitched to me is quite often it's obvious that the person making the game is making the game for themselves. And
Mm.
as we are both trained as marketeers, so I trained as a marketeer originally, so I have formal training, and actually I'm a member of the Chartered Institute of Marketing and have letters after my name for that particular thing. Not that that matters for anything, but I found it a hugely beneficial process to get me able to make good decisions in game design as well. I think,
Mm. Very
and I think
much.
you've got a background in marketing as well. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so in my 20s I actually worked in some of the biggest advertising agencies in London as a creative, and I worked on some pretty big campaigns for companies like PayPal and Amazon. Um, and it was a very good lesson in how to actually talk to people and how to sell to people, because most people actually do not care about whatever you're doing. You might be making a cure for cancer, and I promise you 95% of people will not be interested in whatever you're making.
No, I completely agree, and it's really interesting because I'm a big believer in kind of thinking about. Well, the very first thing I was taught on my first day in marketing was identify and satisfy consumer needs. Now,
Mm.
you just swap out that word consumer with player or whatever else. You're basically we're trying to find out what people want and how do we fulfill it in a good and satisfying way. Um, so I think that's an incredible driver for my thinking in terms of when I'm looking at game design. If I don't know who it is I'm trying to build something for, if I don't separate my own personal desire as a maker with the desires and expectations of the player, um, and I don't ask the important question you just hinted at, which is like, so what? Why should I care? If I don't ask that why should I care question, I've got no chance of making a decent game. I think. I mean, would you agree with that, or have you got different ways of looking at it?
Yeah, I think it's very important to say before we say anything that there is nothing wrong with creation for creation's sake. I think
Fair.
every creative person, whatever discipline it is, including game designers, and I consider even programmers to be incredibly creative, sometimes have the need to just create for creation's sake, and that is a very valid
Completely
experience.
valid.
Yeah, and then moving from that, there is a difference between making something to enjoy yourself and making a commercial product. And by commercial product, I mean, do you intend for this thing to make money?
Yeah.
And that's where I think there is a lot of room for discussion, because it is very important. Creation for creation's sake is very important, just to keep you sane sometimes. Like I would the kind of games that I enjoy making and the kind of games that I am directing is very different, and thank God, because like having that little bit of a divide keeps me sane and
Yeah.
allows me to try new techniques and that sort of stuff, and one influences the other, obviously. um
I can I chuck in another variation on that theme, because I think
mm,
creation for creation's sake, I think, is a really powerful and an important idea, and you're right. Because I move swiftly on to the next one, I probably don't give that enough time, and I just want to make sure people understand I do get that. I
yeah.
spend far too much of my personal life making board games that will never get finished. The second stage, I think, is creation and creativity for communication. And that's not quite the same as the commercial one. Although, obviously, I'm a guy with a hat who wants to make money out of games. Of course, I want to make the commercial games. But I think we should also pay homage to the fact that sometimes you've got creation for as a communication exercise. But I
Mm.
think even there, we still need to know who the audience is. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Like even creation for creation's sake,
Mm.
you're the audience,
Yeah,
you know, and you're always making something for someone, and the purpose can be different. And obviously, all of these different routes overlap massively.
yeah,
Sometimes you might start with something that you want to get an idea across, and ends up being a project that you create for yourself. Vice versa, you might start with something that you've identified there's this gap in the market, and I'm going to attack the gap in the market. I don't care how I feel about it, I'm just going to make a lot of money. But it turns out you're having way too much fun, you don't produce anything viable, but you've had fun, and that's absolutely valid. So it's very messy, but yeah, at the end of the day, you have to think about why you're making this, and then once you figured out why, then next question is for whom.
and I'd go a little bit further, because I think that you make better decisions if you frame them through the idea of the player. So when I'm trying to decide the vision of a game, part of that process is I'm deciding what I'm making it for. So communicating ideas. I want to win awards. I'm never going to win awards. I don't even know why I mentioned that one. It could be I want to make money. It could be I want to communicate something new about a game mechanic. There's all sorts of reasons I might be making a game, but I've got to see that through. I think through a lens of the player, and I think
Mm.
by the more I know about that player, the more I understand that player, the easier it is for me to say, is this function, feature, whatever it is going to be, getting me closer to that player? Is it getting me closer to satisfying that need that I have to make, as well as the need that the player has to play? Does
Yeah.
that work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it's also, especially with young designers and young people who get into the games industry, I notice this fascination with like wanting to really work on a title that they deeply care about because they have that connection. And I find that's a very dangerous territory to venture to, because you can get the same enjoyment of job well done working on a title that maybe you don't care as much about, but you have done a good job on. So I find it's such a weird territory. It sometimes even allows you to look at it with much more like cleaner mind
No,
than.
completely. And actually, I'd go further. I found oddly the games that I love, I'm worse at designing than the games that I
Yeah.
have no interest in. So, for example, I don't care about sport particularly. I'm not,
Yeah.
I like watching football at the pub, but I cannot. I've got too much of my brain dedicated to working out how games work. I cannot learn who's on what football team. But oddly, I've done quite a good job on football games
Yeah.
historically. Weirdly, don't ask me how. I
Because
think
you
the
approach it like a
distance.
scientist, not
Yeah,
like a
that
fan.
yeah, no, exactly that. And I think that isn't that that is so deeply rooted in the way I like to think about game design. For me,
Yeah.
design is a hypothesis, and I've got to
Mm.
test it.
Yeah.
And I think what I've learned personally recently is just the way that the hyper casual game has completely shifted my mindset. Even though I don't make hyper casual games generally, I'm not after
Mm.
making long term retention games, but the techniques of testing early before you've even got a game, I think it's amazing.
Yes.
Absolutely love it, and it means I don't have to spend X thousand, hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds to get to the point where I know the game's going to be liked by anyone. I can
Yeah.
spend 50 quid and find out.
Just don't get your friends to test it because they'll tell you
Oh,
it's great.
actually, my friends tell me how terrible it is, whether it's terrible or not, but that's just because they like me. Oh, something like that. So, let's think about this thing. This audience, we've understand we need to know something about the audience. How do we know anything about an audience?
I think we were chatting about it before we started the recording. It start from somewhere, someone you know. That's always for me. Like obviously you can read a lot of research online, you can research communities, that's absolutely valid. But I found for me the easiest thing is start thinking about someone you know. Like say for example with Elegos, one of the core things for me when I was designing the game was I want a game that anyone can play. That's a very general statement, but for me, then I change it to I want anyone from any physical ability to be able to play it. And that is accessibility as well as thinking about people who, for example, don't have the hand-eye coordination that a lot of long-term seasoned gamers have. So rather than having a difficulty slider that makes the enemies easy and gives you unlimited health or whatever, it's instead think about designing the game in a way that if you can only click with a mouse and you can master the WASD keys, you can still enjoy the game just as much as someone who spent the last 30 years playing RPG games and they don't even think about which key they need to press. So that was very, very key for me. One of the people was actually thinking about my mom and thinking about like, how cool would it be if I make something that my mom can play through without, diluting the story, without diluting the controls, but instead think about what does an interaction look like if you don't have that ability.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I have a slightly different take on it. By the way, I love the fact that you're picking real people. I think that's brilliant. But I like to think about stereotypes. I know that it's not a good thing to pick on stereotypes normally, but as a starting place, I like to start looking at some stereotypes. And I often find it useful to use some of the models that are out there. I mean, for example, a lot of game designers use the Bartle models, the kind of achiever and the socializer. And anyway, I used to know these things off by heart, but one of the issues I have with that particular model, and this is something I'm just quoting what Richard Bartle himself has said, is it was a model that was intended as based on an analysis of behavior of a particular bunch of people playing a particular type of game, and it's possible to extrapolate that. There are some great models that have extrapolated that further, and even more recently, we've seen some of the big data companies like Game Refinery and actually Newzoo. And in fact, I'll put up an example on the screen of the Newzoo guys if my mouse works. So the Newzoo guys put up a kind of like the changing face of game enthusiasts, and they talk about things like the ultimate gamer, the all-round enthusiast, popcorn gamer. I think some of these stereotypes are quite useful as a starting point, but if you just leave it there, you don't know enough about them. And I think there's a couple of things I want to know more. I like to name them. I like to say, this is George. George is my popcorn gamer. Now, who is that person I know that's like George?